I invite you to pray with me. God, we have gathered here to worship you, the source of all life. Open your word to us as we open our hearts and minds to you, and be at work in us with your comforting spirit. And open my mouth to speak your words to your service and praise. Amen. It has to be here somewhere, I said to my son, Alan. Now, the Bose canning factory was over there, and over there was an orchard where we lived in our trailer until about 1962. It was near the dormitory for the summer workers. At least, that's the way I think it was. I should ask Dad. The Boses were a Russian Mennonite entrepreneurial family who opened and ran several canning factories in the Niagara region. Dad was Peter Rogalski. He and my mom, Leona Unger, had both worked for the Boses in the early 50s and then again in the late 50s and 60s, early 60s. I should ask Dad. For the reason that Alan and I were driving past the corner of Lake and Lakeshore in St. Catharines at 1:30 in the morning on July 11th, 2015, was that we had just come from Dad's deathbed at the Niagara Hospital, Niagara Health System St. Catharines site. There was no more asking Dad anything. Now, I had trained myself to plan things to ask Dad for our weekly Monday night phone calls. A difficult relationship with my dad, coming up from abuse in my childhood, meant that when I first took up the task of calling him, the weekly calls were short and difficult. About 5 minutes and I was done. But wouldn't a Christian son, a minister no less, be wanting to be in relationship with his dad? And so I began to gather questions of family and of history, and for stories that he could tell, so the calls would be more grace-filled. And by the time he had died, I had the habit of gathering questions, but no one to ask. Over the months after that, I came to see that when grief was on the rise inside me, I would more often think about asking Dad for something. It happened recently again to me, and I see that as a symptom that I was again grieving. When I began studying as a pastor in the late 1970s, the study of grief was new. Through the years, grief had been downplayed more and more, often moving it completely out of public. If any of you ever watched Downton Abbey, you'll remember seeing the crepe armbands to signify that you were in grief in public in the early 1900s. But over the years, that was seen as maudlin, overworked, too public. And so men, and often women, were expected to just go on with their day-to-day behavior, keeping grief hidden and private. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in her book On Death and Dying, which was published in 1969, began to look at this in a more studious kind of a way, studying grief from a clinical and scientifically observed way. She said that there were 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Granger Westberg, in his 1962 book, Good Grief, listed 10, including shock and physical distress, panic, guilt. The focus on steps of grief made it seem like grief was a linear process. Finish one step, move on to the next one. It was possible to slide back into a previous stage, but that was seen as pathological. People who didn't just keep on moving forward step by step were sick. And that seems to me now to be an unhealthy way of looking at grief. In my years of ministry and observing friends and family and myself, people sometimes get stuck in grief, that's true. Counseling from professional caregivers, as well as patience and much love from both professional and lay caregivers, can help a person resolve the complicated tangle which loss brings. Families and friends need to stick it out with people who are stuck, often those people still weeping years later at the graveside. Perhaps not allowing the departed person's things to be moved or cleaned up. Think of Miss Havisham, if you read Great Expectations. Years later, she was still wearing her wedding dress, and the room was still set for the wedding, which hadn't happened decades before. By the time I got to ministry in the late 1980s, we were seeing things in a less or by the time I got to seminary in the late 1980s, we were seeing grief in a less linear, staged way. People could cycle around and around through the various parts over and over. Each person's grief would follow its own path, taking varying amounts of time. If you look at the graphic that's in the bulletin, you'll see, you see that step-by-step process. It looks, very nice and clear, this step and that step. The other one tends to be more what grief is really like, and sometimes it doesn't actually get all the way to the end. Differences in grieving couples among friends and family often bring disagreements and emotional turmoil to relationships, as folk do not understand each other or give each other room to journey in their own ways and their own schedule. These differences are unfortunately a key reason why so many marriages run into difficulties after the death of a child. Each person in the couple mourns in their own way, and they don't understand their partner's journey or walk alongside them with patience and love. Anne-Marie and I lost a child through a miscarriage early in our marriage, early in the 1980s. And after that, we had what I call the 100-kilometer fight. Driving from Ontario to Winnipeg, where we lived, about 2 months after the loss, we argued for over an hour as I drove. And finally, I stopped, and we figured out that I did not understand her need to continue to grieve. And little did I know that I was also grieving, albeit more subconsciously. In retrospect now, I see many times through my adult life where I grieved, but I wasn't aware of the emotions which I and all those around me were experiencing. When I left my first pastorate, I later realized that I allowed all my houseplants to die from lack of care. And I now see that as an expression of the depression part of my grief work. I should ask Dad. Dad taught me a lot about grief in his last years. Mom died in 2008 at age 73 after spending 7 years in a nursing home due to a degenerative neurological condition. Dad grieved intensely, often going to the graveside to weep for years after she died. And as he grew nearer to his own death from stage 4 prostate cancer, he again began to talk about his grief and his loss. By this time, I had come to know that it wasn't my job to fix him, nor did I have the ability to help him to move on. It was better that I just let him know that I heard him and that I was with him in his grief. I did notice that when he got bad news about his condition or the pain level was on the rise, he grieved more. All his losses and grief seemed to be all mixed together. If you think of yourself as a train car, and as griefs come on, they last for a while and then they go off again. But if lots of them come on at the same time, it gets crowded in there with all these different griefs, and it can be more intense. So rather than stages of grief like either Westberg or Kubler-Ross, I prefer to think about components of grief, which can follow a progression or can move around chaotically. Denial is often the first part of grief. When I drive home from a deathbed as a pastor or from planning a funeral with a family, I often feel disconnected to the reality of the death and the world going on around me. My I should ask Dad was actually my subconscious, a kind of bit of denial, not connecting with the fact that Dad had gone to where I could no longer ask him any questions and expect an answer. In severe cases, denial can become psychotic, with a mourner not really believing that the deceased is gone. Anger is another component. Men in Western culture are especially prone to anger as expressions of grief. We tend to also externalize anxiety in the same way, lashing out to the world around us that won't stay put, is constantly changing, and which is raising in us feelings that we've not been trained to process. I was really upset at parts of my dad's funeral service when my dad's pastor decided to discard the scriptures that I had chosen and inserted others. Others were also angry, and it wasn't just the men. Westberg's physical distress can be psychosomatic symptoms like stomach aches, headaches, tiredness, insomnia, muscle aches. This is connected to the physical components of depression. I found that after my dad's death, work that would have taken me an hour took an hour and 15 or an hour and a half. I couldn't get nearly as much done. Energy and concentration were lacking. Shortly after my dad's death, I was going to interview a friend for an article that I was writing for Canadian Mennonite, and I couldn't find his house until I pulled up my phone and typed his address in, and then Google took me there. And when I got there late, he said, that when his dad had passed, someone had said to him, give it a year. Give it a year until your mental functions return to normal. Since my dad has died, I've had other griefs. With my dad, it took about 9 months before I began to feel normal energy. Sadness and a desire to not have to process other people's grief or pain were part of that time for me. I have a bit of seasonal affect disorder, SAD, every year, but that year it was worse. Kubler-Ross talks about bargaining, and this is our subconscious and our ego's attempt to keep life the way it was. Grief is really about rebuilding ourselves and our lives without the person or the thing or whatever it was that we've lost, be it a job, a possession, a relationship, a hope. We can mourn that something that did not turn out the way we had hoped. We cannot bring the dead back. We cannot become young again. Some things are gone forever from our lives, but we all crave stability. In conscious and unconscious ways, we bargain with ourselves and God and others to get things back to the way they were. And slowly, over the course of grief, we create a new normal without that which is lost. And that would be acceptance. It's going to be okay. I can't fight it. I might as well get used to it. Again, Kubler-Ross and Westberg, working with modern scientific and ordered ways of thinking, see this the stage as a destination. And my experience of my own grief and that of others whom I walked alongside as a friend and pastor is that acceptance is something that comes and goes. While March 2016 brought more energy and wholeness 9 months after my dad's death, Father's Day that year, the June anniversary of his birth, the July anniversary of his death, all brought a return of sadness and other signs of grief. He will always be gone. But I go on without him. There's certainly more peace now than there was earlier on. On the grief journey about my father, I was aided by some significant things and disciplines. The love and care of my spouse, of children, a granddaughter, friends, and peers. The knowledge that this is a normal process that does have a path towards being recentered and refocused. Being patient and gentle with myself, knowing that this is what happens, that it's good, that it's necessary. Doing the self-care that I needed. Rest, food, drink, prayer, my spiritual director, a support group of peers, journaling, accepting others' offers of listening, eventually listening to their stories and observations. Physical exercise, a regular practice of contemplation where I found God gentle and patient with me, without judgment or correction. Sitting with me as I fumed, as I worried, as I grieved. Grief is coming to terms with a new reality that as I look at the evening sky, there's no longer anybody between me and the sunset. But there are other younger generations behind me that see me in silhouette between them as they ponder life and death. So what about Jesus and Lazarus and his sisters? You probably noticed that Martha and Mary grieved quite differently. And if you listen carefully, you would have discovered they use exactly the same words when they confront Jesus. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Exactly the same words. Mary then enters into a theological discussion that gives her great comfort. She is kind of an intellectual personality looking for rational answers. And she finds them, at least to start, as she talks with Jesus. Mary is a whole other case. She's distraught, broken, angry. She's falling apart. This will not have been the first time that she rushed out to weep at the grave. No intellectual discussion here. With Mary, Jesus weeps. He's deeply moved by her tears and her obvious emotions. Show me where he's laid. He groans out. What was Jesus' grief about? Lazarus' suffering, Mary's pain, the condition of humankind? Whatever it was, his grief was real, his suffering empathic, joining Mary and Martha in their different griefs, not criticizing Martha for coldness, nor Mary for overreacting. He simply was with them, each of them, in what they were experiencing. Now, questions still remain about this passage. Why did he wait before he came? We started where he came, but he had waited for 4 or 5 days. Is God so hard-hearted that God allows this kind of suffering in order to provide the raw materials for the miracle that Jesus was about to perform? Why did Jesus grieve, knowing that in just a couple of minutes, he was going to raise Lazarus from the grave? How much did Martha really understand and believe? Jesus tells her, I'm going to raise Lazarus, but she still says, don't open the grave, it stinks. Questions always remain when we grieve. Why? Why now? Why them and me? Why this way? Why death or loss at all? Part of the grief journey is learning to live with unanswered questions, learning to leave them unanswered, and going on living. I invite you to clear your laps of stuff so you can rest your hands open in them like this. This is the way we receive something if somebody's going to give us something. And so we're inviting God to give us something in this time of prayer. And if you feel comfortable, close your eyes and take 5 breaths. Now, I'll count mine. I might breathe faster or slower than you. In this silence, remember griefs that you've experienced and offer them up to God. Just remember them, letting them fall before God. As you do this, does a thought come, a feeling, a message from God? Does God say something? Does God offer you something? Just sit with God in this holy moment. God of life and death. Loss is part of our lives and part of your experience of our lives. In Jesus, you express grief at the loss of Lazarus, Mary's pain, people's refusal to heed your teaching and love, and on and on. You grieve with us. We don't understand the whys, but we often choose to trust in you. Though sometimes our trust in you is frayed in our grief, bring healing through your love and through the love of your people in our lives. We trust in you, the resurrection and the life. Amen.